Of the four challengers for the English crown in 1066, Harold Hardrada of Norway's claim was by far the weakest. However, this would have mattered to him very little. He was, after all, a well-seasoned warrior whose travels had taken him far and wide, from Scandinavia to the Kievan Rus, on to the Byzantine Empire, and beyond. 1066 would not be solved by friendly diplomatic discussions, but by the sword, and Hardrada, in that respect, was arguably the best placed contender. Both Harold Godwinson and Duke William of Normandy were battle-hardened warriors enough, but Harold Hardrada's extensive experiences and his own formidable might stood him in good stead. What would aid the Norwegian king's bid for the English crown was a very useful alliance that he formed with Tostig, the wayward brother of Harold Godwinson. Having been ejected from his earldom of Northumbria, Tostig then moved against his own brother and plotted for himself a path back to power. Having been forced to retreat into Scotland, Tostig found refuge with King Malcolm III, who would later host another failed claimant of 1066, Edgar Atheling. In the shape of Harold Hardrada, with his loose claim to the English crown, Tostig could now see a way of not only reclaiming the power that he once held in England, but perhaps become even stronger. For Hardrada, Tostig would be very useful in garnering support for his claims. Tostig, having assembled his own fleet, linked up with Hardrada, and the two sailed up the River Humber. Their first major obstacle would not be Harold Godwinson, as they may have expected, but two northern earls called Edwin and Morcar, who engaged these unwelcome arrivals in England in battle at Fulford on the 20th of September. The fighting was ferocious, and initially it looked as though the battle was going the way of the English, as many of the Norwegians were cut down because of the sheer ferocity of the English warriors. However, the tide of the battle was swung as latecomers to the battle, who had disembarked off the Norwegian ships last, arrived fresh and helped drive the English back. Eventually the battle was over, and the Norwegians remained in possession of the field of death. Once again, Harold Hardrada had emerged from battle unscathed, but Fulford had nonetheless come at a cost, with his army losing a significant number of men. Following Fulford, Tostig and Hardrada travelled to nearby York, where they forced submission from the locals and restocked their own food and essentials. Hardrada promised the people of York that he would grant them peace if they should supply him with men to bolster his army as he prepared the long march on London, where he hoped he would be crowned. But as these events were transpiring in York, Harold Godwinson was closing in. The English king was a man of remarkable energy, barely stopping for food, drink, and rest as he marched the hundreds of miles to thwart Hardrada and Tostig. Certainly, being in Godwinson's army would not have been much fun. Before Hardrada could even think about setting off for London, he found himself facing off against the English once again, this time at Stamford Bridge. On this occasion, the enemy was led by Harold Godwinson himself. Although his plans had been forced to change, this was not necessarily a disaster for Hardrada. Should he triumph in battle again, and kill or capture Godwinson for good measure, then the path to London would be clear for him. What's more, his men were coming off the back of a fresh and recent victory, so they should be confident. However, before the battle began, a bad sign befell the Norwegian king, as relayed by the chronicler Theodore the Monk, and as King Harold himself, mounted on horseback, endeavoured to draw up his battle lines, his horse stumbled, and he was thrown to the ground, whereupon he is reported to have said, "Seldom is a sign of this sort an omen of victory." Whether Hardrada actually uttered these exact words is questionable. They seem to be rather defeatist, that go against Hardrada's more bullish nature. Meanwhile, in the English camp, Godwinson was confident himself, promising he would grant Hardrada only 7 feet of English land in order to bury him, with Hardrada, as legend has it, standing at around 7 foot in height. Famously, the English would triumph at Stamford Bridge, but not without stubborn resistance from Hardrada's army. The dogged resistance was typified by one Norwegian warrior who stood resolute and determined over a bridge, preventing the English from crossing and creating further damage to the Norwegian ranks. However, eventually, an English soldier found a way of sneaking under the bridge and stabbed the brave defender from underneath, allowing the English to flood over the bridge. The Norwegians were forced to flee for their lives as the English cut them down in their scores. Desperate to return to their ships, some of Hardrada's men were drowned, others burned, and only a select few managed to return. Among those to fall were Hardrada himself and Tostig. Among the survivors was Hardrada's son Olaf, who himself would soon be king of Norway. But Olaf had only received a passage of safe conduct after submitting to Godwinson. That then was the end of Harold Hardrada, a truly remarkable man. We'll close with a description of Hardrada's life by Theodore the monk. This Harold had performed many bold deeds in his youth, overthrowing many heathen cities and carrying off great riches in Russia and in Africa. From there he travelled to Jerusalem and was everywhere greatly renowned and victorious. After he had travelled through Sicily and taken much wealth by force, he came to Constantinople, and there he was arraigned before the emperor. But he inflicted an amply shameful disgrace upon that same emperor, and, making an unexpected escape, he slipped away. Stamford Bridge didn't just see the end of Hardrada's extraordinary life, but it also spelled the end of the Viking Age. Hardrada's life is indicative of the history of the Vikings, one full of adventure. It is true that Scandinavian interest in England wasn't quite done yet, as Edgar Atheling pushed his own claims during the reign of William the Conqueror by allying himself with King Svein II of Denmark. And before Hastings, Duke William would remind his Normans of their origins. But England was now on the brink of a new era, as the Normans not only conquered the country, but drove it forward into a more advanced age, albeit through brutish methods. Hardrada's invasion rather harkened back to a bygone era of Viking raids, and it seems to me that it was probably a good job that his invasion failed.